Have you ever wondered whether the revolutionary farming methods filling social media feeds today, companion planting, organic fertilizers, composting, and rebuilding exhausted soil, are truly new? In reality, many of these ideas were discovered, tested, and refined by skilled farmers long before modern agriculture gave them new names. Welcome back to Earthly Delights, where we reconnect with the soil beneath our feet. Today, we are traveling back to the American South of the 1950s. But this is not simply a journey through old photographs. We are uncovering a buried library of practical knowledge, built through years of observing weather, soil, insects, animals, and plants. At that time, black farmers owned more than 12 million acres of farmland across the United States. By the turn of the millennium, however, more than 90% of that land had been lost. And when families were separated from their farms, generations of experience with seeds, soil fertility, water, pests, and community survival were also at risk of disappearing. In this video, we will explore 12 traditional farming techniques used by black farmers during the mid-20th century. These methods helped keep soil productive, reduce crop damage, lower farming costs, and strengthen local independence. They were more than clever gardening tricks. For many farmers, they were practical tools for survival in a system that often denied them fair credit, reliable markets, and equal support. After World War II, large-scale farming increasingly promoted monoculture, synthetic fertilizers, chemical pesticides, and costly machinery. As that system expanded, many low-cost ecological practices were dismissed, pushed aside, or left undocumented. But here is the hopeful part. This knowledge can still help gardens, homesteads, and small farms today. It reminds us that healthy soil does not always begin with an expensive product. Sometimes it begins with observation, cooperation with nature, and respect for wisdom passed from one generation to the next. So pour yourself a cup of tea, step into the garden with me, and let us open the living library still waiting beneath our feet. Trick 1. Polycultural intercropping and nitrogen-fixing symbiosis walk. Through a large industrial farm today, and you may see row after row of the same crop stretching toward the horizon. That system is efficient for machinery, but it also leaves the field dependent on outside fertilizers and vulnerable to pests, weeds, and weather. On many traditional black-operated farms in the 1950s, the landscape looked very different. Corn, beans, peas, squash, sweet potatoes, okra, and other crops often grew side by side in carefully planned combinations. One of the most useful arrangements paired legumes, such as cowpeas, lima beans, or field peas, with tall, nutrient-hungry crops like corn. Legumes work with specialized bacteria around their roots to capture nitrogen from the air. Much of that nitrogen supports the legume itself, but the crop residues and roots can later return valuable fertility to the soil. Meanwhile, sturdy corn stalks provide a natural structure for climbing beans, reducing the need for separate stakes or trellises. At ground level, broad squash leaves or spreading sweet potato vines form a living cover over the soil. Their shade helps slow evaporation, reduces the space available for weeds, and protects the soil surface from the direct impact of heavy rain. Farmers could also arrange crops such as okra, cowpeas, and roselle together, using differences in height, growth habit, and root depth to make better use of limited land. This was not random planting. It was a practical system built through observation. Each crop performed a different job. One climbed, one covered the ground, one produced food, and another helped restore fertility. Instead of forcing every plant to compete in identical rows, farmers created a small ecosystem in which the crops supported one another. As synthetic nitrogen fertilizers became more common after World War II, many farms shifted toward purchased inputs and single-crop production. Yet the older lesson remains useful today. By combining legumes with corn, vegetables, and ground-covering crops, we can reduce bare soil, support soil life, and make a garden more productive without relying entirely on fertilizer from a bag. Trick 2. The underground seed saving and exchange networks. A farming community can lose its independence quickly when it loses control of its seed. Today, many growers purchase new seed each season, especially when using commercial hybrids whose next generation may not reliably produce the same qualities as the parent crop. But in the 1950s, Many black farming families protected themselves through strong seed saving and exchange networks. At the end of each harvest, farmers did not save seed from just any plant. They watched the field carefully and selected from the strongest specimens, the plants that endured drought, resisted disease, escaped heavy insect damage, and still produced a dependable crop. Over many seasons, that careful selection created varieties increasingly suited to the heat, rainfall, soil, and pests of a particular community. Once collected, the seeds were dried thoroughly before storage. Families kept them in glass jars, old tins, cloth sacks, or other containers available on the farm. In some places, small amounts of clean, dry wood ash were used with certain stored seeds to discourage insects, although keeping the seed dry and protected remained essential. The real strength of the system was not only how the seeds were stored, but how they traveled. Families exchanged them through churches, neighbors, relatives, markets, and community gatherings. A bean saved by one household might be planted miles away the following spring. In this way, valuable genetics were not trapped in a single garden where one flood, drought, or family hardship could erase them. These seeds also carried memory. They were connected to familiar meals, family traditions, and crops adapted to southern growing conditions. When black families lost farmland or were forced to relocate, they often lost more than acreage. They also lost access to local varieties and the community relationships that had kept those seeds alive. Saving open-pollinated seed today can still be a practical act of resilience. It reduces dependence, preserves diversity, and allows a variety to adapt gradually to your own garden. A seed may look small, but inside it are seasons of selection, family knowledge, and the possibility of another harvest. The question is not only what you will grow this year, but what you will preserve for the next generation. Trick 3. Lunar cycle crop alignment. Planting by the moon. Mention planting by the moon today, and some people will immediately call it folklore. Yet for generations, black farmers, indigenous growers, and many other rural communities organized parts of their planting calendar around the changing moon. This practice came from long observation of the sky, seasonal weather, soil moisture, and the repeated rhythms of farm life. Traditional moon planting usually divided the month into two broad periods. During the waxing phase, from the new moon toward the full moon, farmers often favored crops that produced above the ground, including leafy greens, corn, beans, and brassicas. During the waning phase, from the full moon back toward the new moon, they commonly planted root crops such as sweet potatoes, carrots, and turnips, or carried out work connected with roots, pruning, and transplanting. The explanation often given was that the moon influences water, just as it influences ocean tides, and might therefore affect moisture in the soil or movement within plants. Modern research has not firmly established that lunar phases alone produce better germination or stronger crops, so this tradition should not replace attention to soil temperature, rainfall, frost dates, or seed requirements. Still, that does not make the old practice meaningless. For farmers without digital forecasts or irrigation sensors, a lunar calendar offered a consistent way to organize work and observe conditions from one month to the next. It encouraged them to look closely at moisture, plant response, night temperatures, and seasonal changes. The moon may have served not only as a physical influence, but also as a dependable clock in the sky. For gardeners today, planting by the moon can be treated as an optional tradition rather than a guaranteed formula. You can compare beds planted during different phases while keeping the same seed, soil, and watering conditions. The results may teach you something about your own garden, even if the strongest influences turn out to be temperature and moisture rather than moonlight. In an age of weather apps and automated systems, this method reminds us of something valuable. Good growers do not only read screens, they also watch the sky, touch the soil, record what happens, and learn from patterns repeated over many seasons. Trick 4. Closed-loop composting and mycological rebuilding. Long before the phrase soil food web became popular, traditional farmers understood a simple truth. Healthy crops begin with living soil. They may not have used modern scientific terms such as mycorrhizal fungi or microbial diversity, but they clearly saw that land rich in organic matter held more water, produced stronger plants, and recovered more quickly after heat, drought, and heavy rain. On a well-managed farm, very little organic material was wasted. Dry leaves, forest leaf mold, straw, stalks, and other carbon-rich materials were combined with nitrogen-rich ingredients such as chicken manure, cow manure, green weeds, and crop residues. Eggshells might be added in small amounts, while wood ash was sometimes used carefully where the soil needed potassium or a rise in pH. These materials were piled where they could be kept moist but not waterlogged. Farmers turned or loosened the pile so air could reach the center, allowing decomposition to continue without producing a foul, stagnant mass. Over time, rough waste was transformed into dark, crumbly compost with an earthy smell and a structure that blended easily into the soil. The value of this compost went far beyond supplying a quick dose of nutrients. It increased organic matter, improved drainage in heavy ground, helped sandy soil retain moisture, and provided food for bacteria, fungi, earthworms, and other decomposers. In healthy soil, beneficial fungi can form close relationships with plant roots, effectively extending the area from which plants obtain water and nutrients. After World War II, concentrated NPK fertilizers offered farmers a fast and convenient way to feed crops. But fertilizer alone could not replace the structure, carbon, and biological activity supplied by decomposed organic matter. When soil was repeatedly cropped without enough residue or compost being returned, it could become compacted, less resilient, and increasingly dependent on purchased inputs. The old closed-loop approach remains practical today. Kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, animal bedding, and crop waste can all become resources when managed correctly. Wood ash should be used sparingly and only when appropriate for the soil. But the larger lesson is simple. Do not merely feed the plant for one season. Build the soil so it can support healthy plants for many seasons to come. Trick 5. Trap cropping. Nature's decoy. Imagine walking into the garden one morning and finding your collard leaves riddled with tiny holes. Flea beetles have arrived, and the crop you hope to harvest now looks like lace. The quickest reaction may be to spray the entire bed, but a broad treatment can also harm bees, ladybugs, predatory insects, and other helpful creatures working quietly among the plants. Traditional black farmers used a more selective strategy, trap cropping. Instead of trying to make every plant unattractive to pests, they placed a crop the insects preferred near the vegetables they wanted to protect. Mustard greens, for example, can attract certain flea beetles more strongly than collards. A border or nearby row of mustard could draw part of the pest pressure away from the main crop. The trap crop was not simply planted and forgotten. Farmers watched it closely. When insects concentrated on the decoy plants, those plants could be removed, treated, or destroyed before the pests spread back into the field. The farmer might sacrifice a small row of inexpensive mustard to reduce damage across a much larger planting of marketable greens. Other companion plants also had specific uses. Certain marigold varieties, when grown properly and incorporated into a rotation, can help suppress some soil-dwelling nematodes. Nasturtiums and flowering borders may attract insects away from selected crops or provide food and shelter for beneficial predators. But no single flower repels every pest, and trap cropping works best when the chosen decoy matches the insect causing the problem. This method depended on observation rather than guesswork. Farmers needed to know which pest was present, which plant it preferred, when it arrived, and how close the trap crop should be placed. That knowledge made pest control more targeted and reduced the need to spray the entire field. The same principle can strengthen a home garden today. Plant mustard near susceptible brassicas, inspect it frequently, and act when pests gather there. Combine that strategy with crop rotation, row covers, healthy soil, and habitat for beneficial insects. A trap crop is not merely decoration. Used correctly, it becomes a living early warning system and a carefully placed decoy that helps protect the harvest. Trick 6. Contour farming and rainwater. Terracing water keeps a farm alive, but on the hillsides of the American South, a summer storm could become destructive within minutes. Rain rushing downhill stripped away fertile topsoil, carried compost out of the field, and cut deep gullies through land that had taken years to improve. Straight rows running up and down a slope made the problem worse because they created open channels for water to accelerate. Traditional black farmers reduced that damage by shaping their fields around the land rather than forcing the land into straight lines. Instead of plowing vertically down the hill, they followed the natural contours of the slope. Planting beds and small earthen ridges curved across the hillside, forming barriers that interrupted the flow of runoff. When heavy rain arrived, each contour slowed the water and spread it across a wider area. Soil and organic matter were more likely to remain in the field instead of washing away. The slower-moving water also had more time to soak into the ground, replenishing moisture around plant roots and reducing pressure on the lowest parts of the property. On steeper ground, farmers could create small terraces that divided one long slope into shorter steps. These structures needed careful placement and maintenance because poorly designed terraces could overflow or concentrate water in dangerous places. When built correctly, however, they protected topsoil, improved infiltration, and helped crops endure dry periods after summer storms. This principle is just as useful in a modern garden. If your property slopes, watch where water moves during rainfall before digging. Beds can be positioned along the contour, while shallow swales or planted berms can slow runoff and guide it into safe areas. Deep-rooted grasses, shrubs, and cover crops can further stabilize the soil. The goal is not to trap every drop or create standing water around roots. It is to slow, spread, and absorb rainfall safely. Instead of allowing water and soil to leave the property together, contour farming teaches us to work with gravity and shape the land so it behaves more like a sponge. Trick 7. Winter cover, cropping, and green manuring. What does your garden look like in the middle of winter? If the beds are bare, hard rain can loosen topsoil, wash nutrients away, and damage its structure. Traditional farmers understood a lasting lesson. Living soil should remain protected. After the autumn harvest, many farmers sowed winter rye, hairy vetch, crimson clover, or a mixture of grasses and legumes. Through the cold months, their roots anchored the ground and reduced erosion. The foliage softened the impact of rain, slowed evaporation, and sheltered earthworms and other soil organisms beneath a living winter blanket. Each crop performed a different job. Rye produced abundant roots and carbon-rich material, while vetch and clover worked with soil bacteria to fix nitrogen. Together, they protected the surface, captured leftover nutrients, improved soil structure, and prepared the field for spring. Before planting the main crop, farmers cut, rolled, or crimped the cover. The flattened plants could remain on the surface as mulch, or be worked lightly into the soil as green manure. As the residues decomposed, they returned nutrients and organic matter. Left above ground, they also suppressed many weeds, conserved moisture, and protected young corn, cotton, or sweet potatoes. Timing mattered. Cover crops were usually stopped before mature seed formed, and thick residues sometimes needed time to begin breaking down before small seeds were planted. Legumes released nitrogen more readily, while mature rye created a longer-lasting mulch. This system turned winter into a season of soil building. Instead of leaving beds exposed or buying plastic barriers, farmers let roots and leaves grow renewable protection. We can do the same today and allow nature to prepare the ground for the next harvest. Trick 8. Biological wildlife integration and natural predators. In our desire for a spotless garden, we can make the mistake of removing every wild corner and treating every insect as an enemy. Traditional farmers knew a resilient farm is not isolated from nature. It works as part of a community in which birds, insects, plants, and soil organisms maintain balance. Instead of spraying every pest, farmers created places where natural predators could live and feed. Wooden nest boxes near fields attracted insect-eating birds, such as bluebirds. Swallows patrolled open areas for flying insects, while other native birds searched leaves and stems for caterpillars, beetles, and moths. Farmers also preserved strips of grasses, wildflowers, and lightly disturbed vegetation around crop fields. These borders provided nectar, pollen, shelter, and nesting sites for lacewings, hoverflies, ladybugs, spiders, and small predatory wasps. Many of these helpers consumed aphids, caterpillars, and other pests before their numbers became destructive. The goal was not to create a garden with no insects. Predators also need prey to remain nearby. The aim was balance. Enough habitat to support helpful species and enough observation to notice when pest numbers were growing too quickly. Broad-spectrum pesticides could break this relationship by killing predators and pollinators along with the target pest. Once those allies disappeared, aphids or caterpillars often returned, leaving the farmer dependent on repeated spraying. We can use the same principle today by planting flowers with different bloom times, preserving a native border, providing clean water, and installing nest boxes. Are we creating a sterile space that needs constant intervention, or a welcoming ecosystem where native helpers share the work of protecting the harvest? Trick 9. Biological weeding and fertilizing with cotton patch geese. What if part of the farm's weed control could walk through the rows, eat unwanted grass, and leave manure behind while it worked? That was the role of the cotton patch goose, a light-bodied heritage breed long associated with farms in the American South. These geese became valuable biological weeders because they preferred tender grasses and sedges over several broadleaf crops. Farmers released managed flocks into fields of cotton, tobacco, corn, mint, and sweet potatoes, where the birds grazed weeds between the rows. Crabgrass, nutgrass, and other young weeds were especially attractive while they were soft and easy to clip. Their light bodies and webbed feet allowed them to move over damp ground with less compaction than heavy machinery. As they grazed, they also deposited manure containing nitrogen and other nutrients. The birds therefore performed two useful jobs at once, reducing weed pressure and returning fertility to the field. But this system was not effortless. Geese needed fencing, water, shade, protection from predators, and regular supervision. They had to be introduced when crops were established enough to avoid trampling and while weeds were still young. Hungry birds might sample plants they normally ignored, so successful farmers watched their flock closely and moved it before crop damage occurred. Cotton patch geese also offered value beyond weeding. Families appreciated their hardiness, tolerance of southern heat, alert nature, and ability to reproduce on pasture. They could turn vegetation into manure, meat, eggs, and goslings, making them well-suited to diversified farms. As mechanical cultivation and chemical herbicides became more common, demand for weeding geese declined, and the breed became increasingly rare. A living farm worker was replaced by machinery and purchased products that seemed faster and easier to standardize. For modern homesteaders, these birds are not a universal replacement for hoes, mulch, or every herbicide application. Yet, in the right setting, with responsible management, they can become part of an integrated weed control system. They remind us that livestock can do more than produce food. Properly matched to the land, animals can manage vegetation, cycle nutrients, and help the farm function as one connected ecosystem. Trick 10. Direct-to-consumer, pre-financed clientele membership clubs. If you have joined a community-supported agriculture program or visited a pick-your-own farm, you have experienced a model closely connected to ideas promoted by Black agricultural scientist Dr. Booker T. Whatley. As small farms struggled to compete with large commodity operations, Whatley argued that the answer was not always to become bigger. His philosophy was to farm smaller and smarter. A family farm could not easily defeat an industrial operation by growing the same low-value grain on less land. It needed diversified, high-value crops and a direct relationship with loyal customers. One of his best-known ideas was the Clientele Membership Club. Families from nearby towns paid a membership fee near the beginning of the season. That early income helped the farmer purchase seed, tools, compost, and other supplies without relying entirely on high-interest loans or waiting until harvest for the first payment. In return, members received access to fresh farm products and, in many versions, the opportunity to harvest crops themselves. Pick-your-own production reduced some harvesting, packing, and marketing costs. Customers received fresh food and a countryside experience, while the farmers sold directly instead of surrendering much of the final value to wholesalers and retailers. Whatley encouraged farmers to avoid unnecessary middlemen. A small grower needed to keep as much of the retail value as possible. Direct sales also allowed farmers to learn what customers wanted, plan a wider crop mix, and build loyalty beyond a single market day. The model still required careful management. Farmers needed crops ready throughout the season. Clear membership rules, safe access, dependable communication, and enough nearby customers. Prepayment also created a responsibility to provide value, even when weather or pests reduced production. Today, CSA subscriptions, farm memberships, produce boxes, U-pick fields, and roadside stands continue this principle. The customer helps finance the season, and the farmer returns that trust with food, transparency, and a closer connection to the land. For a small farm, independence is built not only in the field, but through a community willing to invest before the harvest arrives. Trick 11. Community land cooperatives. The pig bank and cooperative farms. No farmer succeeds entirely alone. For black farming families facing discriminatory lending, unfair markets, political intimidation, and land loss, cooperation became more than a business strategy. It was a way to protect food, dignity, and community survival. In 1969, civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer helped establish the Freedom Farm Cooperative in Sunflower County, Mississippi. Families pooled limited resources to obtain land, grow food, create work, and support people punished economically for demanding voting rights. Over time, the cooperative expanded to hundreds of acres and served many local families. Members raised sweet potatoes, butter beans, greens, and other foods. The harvest helped families who were hungry or had lost jobs, housing, or access to credit. By sharing land, equipment, labor, and crops, the community created options that discriminatory institutions had denied them. One of its most memorable programs was the pig bank. A household could receive a pregnant sow, care for her, and raise the litter. The family kept most of the piglets for food, income, or breeding, then returned 2 young pigs so the cooperative could help another household. The support multiplied instead of ending with one recipient. Each litter expanded the number of families able to produce meat and build a small economic asset. The system carried a simple responsibility: receive help, care for it well, and return enough to keep the circle growing. Freedom Farm showed that security can also be built through shared ownership, mutual aid, and stewardship of productive land. The same principle lives on in community gardens, equipment cooperatives, seed exchanges, and tool libraries. A strong farm grows crops, but a strong agricultural community also grows relationships that carry people through difficult seasons. Trick 12. Sensory soil diagnostics. Reading the soil. We have reached the final and perhaps most intimate technique. Today, gardeners can send soil to a laboratory for measurements of pH, organic matter, and nutrients. Before testing was widely available, farmers relied on their hands, eyes, and noses to judge the ground. They lifted moist soil and squeezed it gently. Soil rich in organic matter often felt crumbly and springy, held together in small aggregates, and broke apart without becoming hard. Depleted ground might appear dusty, crusted, compacted, or unable to hold moisture. Rubbing it between the fingers also revealed whether it contained more sand, silt, or clay. Color offered another clue. Darker ground often suggested accumulated organic matter, while pale or eroded areas warned that topsoil had been lost. Farmers looked for earthworm channels, fine roots, decomposing residues, and openings that allowed air and water to move. They watched how quickly rain entered the soil and whether roots spread freely or turned along a compacted layer. Smell mattered as well. Fresh, well-aerated soil often carried an earthy aroma associated with microbial activity. A sour, rotten, or sulfur-like odor could signal waterlogging and too little oxygen. These observations did not give exact numbers, but they helped growers notice trouble before crops showed serious stress. Some historical accounts describe tasting soil, but that is not safe today. Soil may contain harmful bacteria, parasites, pesticides, waste, or heavy metals that flavor cannot reveal. Acidity should be measured with a proper test, and lime or wood ash should not be added simply because soil appears sour. Modern gardeners can combine both approaches. Use your senses to examine texture, smell, drainage, roots, and biological activity. Then use a soil test for reliable pH and nutrient information. A report provides numbers. Daily contact shows how soil behaves. The deeper lesson remains unchanged. Soil is not empty material that merely holds plants upright. It is a living system, and growers learn what healthy soil is telling them. The ground beneath our feet, 12 practices. 12 pieces of an agricultural inheritance shaped by observation, hardship, creativity, and a close relationship with the land. From intercropping legumes and protecting winter soil to working with Cotton Patch Geese and building Dr. Booker T. Whatley's customer networks, these methods were never only about a larger harvest. They helped families reduce costs, preserve food, share resources, and maintain independence, in circumstances that often worked against them. When black farmers were denied fair credit, excluded from agricultural programs, pressured by discriminatory markets, or forced from family land, the loss was greater than acreage. Communities also lost seed varieties, local experience, relationships, and generations of knowledge passed down through practice rather than books. Yet that living library did not disappear. Pieces remain in saved seeds, family stories, heritage livestock, cooperative traditions, and the soil itself. Every time we plant legumes beside demanding crops, protect bare ground with a cover crop, set a trap crop near vulnerable vegetables, or share a locally adapted seed, we bring part of that knowledge back into use. Recovering these practices does not mean rejecting modern tools or repeating every old belief without question. Good farming has always depended on observation, testing, and adaptation. We can combine traditional wisdom with soil analysis, weather forecasts, safer pest management, and the best evidence today. Technology can be useful, but it is not the only form of progress. You do not need hundreds of acres or costly machinery to begin. A backyard bed, small homestead, or a community plot is enough. Start by protecting the soil, reducing waste, growing diversity, and noticing how plants, animals, water, and people support one another. Thank you for joining Earthly Delights. Tell me which practice you would try, and share this story with another gardener who believes old knowledge can still grow something valuable. Until next time, keep your hands in the soil, keep your mind open, and continue listening to the quiet wisdom beneath your feet. Bye for now.